Gene, let's start with you, since we're especially highlighting Apollo 17 tonight, and you were the commander of that mission. But you often tell a story about hearing about Al Shepard's flight when you were a naval aviator, and you were on a kind of a different track, but again, maybe not so different. Here you were a naval aviator, then 10 years later you're riding this 363-foot Saturn V filled with liquid fuel, can't get life insurance, all those cool things you guys got to enjoy. 10 years later, and you also were a backup commander to Al Shepard. So what was going on during those Mercury years, 1961? What was going through your head as Al Shepard made that first 15-minute flight?
And I didn't know Al Shepard. I didn't know who Al was. I think you did, Dick. And I was just a young snotty-nosed lieutenant, naval aviator. I just came off of my second cruise right here in San Diego. I was stationed at Miramar. And how we ever let the Marines steal that from us, I will never know.
I second that one, Gene.
And I was married here right at the chapel at Miramar. Came back from my second cruise, and in March, April, and you know, I'd heard a little bit about the space program. We were doing our thing over there. Never thought too much about it. And Alan Shepard lifted off into space on the 5th of May. I was getting married on the 6th of May. So my mind was obviously elsewhere.
Another thing,
okay.
yeah.
I wonder why.
But I remember distinctly someone asking me, thereabouts that time frame, how I would like to do that. And I was behind the defense of a television screen. Oh, sure, baby, I fly jets. I'd love to do that. Just give me a chance. I'll be glad to jump on a rocket. I was more like Wally. That was a dumb thing to do, right? And I said, yeah, I'd like to do that, but by the time I get good enough, by the time I meet all of NASA's requirements, there won't be anything left to do. The pioneering will be over. All these other guys are going to do it, and so I'll just stay where I am. Went from here to postgraduate school. By the way, lived right up on in a little duplex in Del Mar, for those of you who are from San Diego. I was making about $8,000 a month, and I paid about $60,000 or $70,000 a year. I mean, $8,000 a year.
Big money, big lucrative money.
$8,000 a year. Woo! And was paying about $60 or $70 a month rent, and this duplex was right on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It's still there. And I asked someone, what could I buy it for today?
And you're not going to share that?
No, I'm not even going to. I tell you, it's close to the national debt. I'm not going to. But anyway, to finish your question, I ended up going to postgraduate school, and within 2.5 years, I ended up in a space program. And if someone says, why me? I've never yet been able to answer that question.
All right, Dick Gordon can answer some questions. Dick, you served with Pete Conrad before you both became astronauts. You'd known some of the Mercury guys before joining the program. What's a little bit of what comes to mind when you're thinking about Project Mercury? And of course, you knew a lot of these guys. You had a different perspective, maybe.
Well, my perspective, Mark, was wanting to be one of them. I went to test pilot school in 1957. Al Shepard was one of my flight instructors. And I figured if he could do it, so could I. And I was flying the Phantom in 1958. Incidentally, VF-96 was the squadron, the second squadron that was trained in the Phantom, and I deployed with that afterwards. But in 1958, when I was testing the Phantom, John Glenn had the class desk in the Pentagon. It's a naval facility there. We wasn't in the Pentagon. He was a class desk officer on the Crusader III, and the Phantom was in competition with the Crusader at that time, so I met John Glenn during that competition, and I figured, hell, if John Glenn could do it, so could I. So that was my association with the Mercury guys. Gordon Cooper came out to Patuxent River to fly some Navy airplanes in a specific test, so I got to know Gordon at that time as well. So I was familiar with most of them. Wally Schirra, Pete Conrad, and Jim Lovell were a year behind me in test pilot school, so it was my familiarity with them was associated with my work at Test Center.
That's Dick Gordon. And what's really great about this, and you can sense you're going to be hearing something that's very unusual tonight, because there's a whole new generation or two who have never heard any of this and who know Buzz Aldrin isn't he the guy on Dancing with the Stars? He is indeed the guy Dancing with the Stars, and he can do it, but he's got a little bum something. That's his excuse tonight. Buzz, let me ask you, would you have liked to have flown in the Mercury program if you think back to that? I mean, Orbital Rendezvous, you are indeed Dr. Rendezvous, MIT, all of that.
I was in a fighter squadron in 1956 to 1959, and the guy who talked me into getting into this particular squadron in Germany was Ed White. Ed and I were on the track team
First man to walk in space.
At West Point. And Ed rotated back and went to Michigan, and then he went to the test pilot school, and he was testing, and I left Germany and went to MIT, and 1962 comes along, and Ed writes me a little note, and he says, hey, I understand NASA's gonna look for some more astronauts, and I meet the qualification, so I'm gonna apply. And I said, Ed, damn it, I can shoot gunnery better than you can, so I'll apply too. Well, obviously they weren't about to select somebody who wasn't among the cream of the crop of the test pilot category. Some of us think more of the future than how we can perfect today's airplanes. I remember before all this happened, Ed had left the squadron, and Life magazine came out, and it showed a picture of the Mercury and the rocket they were going to go on, and it said you had to be a test pilot. And I said, well, okay, so I missed that one. And I guess I did in '62. But somehow they changed the rules, right, Gene? And you didn't have to be a test pilot in 1963. So some of us snuck in under the radar.
All right, Jack Schmitt. It's other guys, fighter pilots, test pilots, rendezvous experts, MIT brains, might reasonably expect to be involved in the Mercury program and beyond. When you heard about the first Americans flying into space, did you ever imagine this was something that was on your to-do list, career-wise?
No, I didn't have any insight into that at all, other than when I was climbing up and down the sides of Norwegian fjords working on my PhD thesis. It happened to coincide with the launch of the of Sputnik 1. I heard about it over Voice of America out of Tangier.
That was what, 57?
57.
Yeah.
And that caught my attention slightly, that there was a human being or a spacecraft in orbit. Because at Caltech, a number of my friends had gone into the missile industry, and I hadn't paid much attention to what they were doing at all. But this started to tweak my interest, and it really was tweaked when I got back to Oslo and began to talk with the international students in residence at the University of Oslo. And Sputnik meant an awful lot to them, ladies and gentlemen. It scared them. They did not, they'd been very critical of the United States, as usual. But when suddenly the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the technological race, and particularly the missile race, that bothered them. And that got my, shall we say, geopolitical attention. But as far as thinking about ever participating, I had no such thought. The next time something came up was the National Academy of Sciences had done a study, probably in 1963, I would say. I had been watching the Mercury flights as I drove up to ski areas in Vermont and New Hampshire.
Well, the training that you had to go through. Yeah.
Listening to them on the radio. But in '63, the National Academy of Sciences did a study and said the first person on the moon ought to be a geologist. Well, that got our attention in the upper floors of the Geology Museum at Harvard. And we laughed about it and toasted a few beers.
We laughed about it.
Yeah. And still no particular thought. And the first real idea I had was after I'd gone to work for Eugene Shoemaker in Flagstaff, not being able to find a useful employment anywhere else. And NASA and the Academy all of a sudden put out this bulletin that appeared on our bulletin board saying we want scientists and engineers for the Group 4 astronaut selection. And I thought about 10 seconds and raised my hand and basically volunteered, although I did touch base with Gene Shoemaker, having had made a commitment to him to work. And he said, hey, that's what I want to do, and I can't. Gene, unfortunately, had been diagnosed by that time with Addison's disease, and pretty well took him out of the running. And so that, the first thing I really thought I had was right there when I saw that announcement. It seemed like the thing to do. I knew I was going to regret if I didn't apply, and somebody did indeed go to the moon. And the idea of a requirement to go to jet pilot training would just made it that more interesting and attractive.
This is what's really great. I mean, you can relate in your everyday life. We all can. But where you make certain choices and your ear kind of tunes to something and you go, well, what if I do that? I mean, that's the reality, this kind of the backstory on all